What if nothing in your life was ever truly unfinished? What if every abandoned dream, every unsent message, was being kept somewhere safe? Tonight we visit the Keeper. This story is about the narratives we tell ourselves about our lives, the stories we think we're living versus the ones we're actually living as you. Listen, there's no need to follow every detail. Just let the words wash over you like gentle waves. If you drift away, that's perfect. That's exactly what should happen. There existed a library that held every possible version of every person's life story. Not predictions, not prophecies, but actual narratives. Fully realized stories of lives that could have been lived were being lived in. Some quantum sense or might still be lived depending on choices made. The library was infinite. Its shelves stretched beyond comprehension. Each person had thousands of volumes dedicated to them. Each book, a complete life story with a different set of choices, different turning points, different endings. The librarian was a being who existed outside of linear time, cataloging and organizing these infinite possibilities. They had no name, or rather, had so many names that having one was meaningless. For simplicity, visitors called them the Keeper. The Keeper's appearance shifted depending on who was looking. To some, they appeared as an elderly woman with kind eyes. To others, a young man with infinite patience. The form didn't matter, only the work mattered. Helping people find the story they were actually living, among all the stories they thought they should be living. Myra Patel was 41 years old when she stumbled into the library, though she had no memory of entering. One moment she was walking home from work, exhausted and disoriented by a life that felt increasingly unfamiliar. The next moment, she stood in an impossibly vast space filled with books. The Keeper appeared beside her, and before Myra could ask where she was, they handed her a book, heavy, leather-bound, her name embossed in gold on the cover. Myra Patel, The Life of Achievement. Myra opened it. The book detailed her life exactly as she'd been living it. The prestigious university, the high-powered career in corporate law, the carefully curated resume, the strategic networking, the 60-hour work weeks, the apartment she was never in, the relationships sacrificed for advancement. Reading it felt like watching her life from outside, and what struck her most was how joyless it all seemed on the page. Every chapter about an achievement, every page about success, but nowhere, not in 400 pages, was there a moment of genuine happiness, of deep satisfaction, of feeling truly alive. "Is this my life?" Myra asked. "It's one of them," the Keeper replied, "the one you've been reading from. But it's not the only one." They gestured to a shelf, hundreds of books, all bearing Myra's name, all different subtitles. Myra Patel, The Life of Connection. Myra Patel, The Life of Creation. Myra Patel, The Life of Service. Myra Patel, The Life of Adventure. On and on, each one a complete life, fully realized, based on different values, different choices, different definitions of what mattered. "Can I read them?" Myra asked. "You can read one more," the Keeper said. "Choose carefully. Once you've read a second story of your life, you'll never be able to read the first one the same way again. You'll always know there were alternatives, that you chose one story over others, Myra stood before the shelf of her possible lives, overwhelmed. How do you choose which story to read when? Each one represents a fundamental reorientation of everything. Her hand moved toward the life of achievement again. It was familiar, safe, known, but the keeper gently redirected her attention. You've already read that one, you're living it. Choose a different one. See what you've been missing. Myra's fingers traced the spines. Some stories called to her more than others. Then she saw one that made her breath catch. Myra Patel, the life she wanted at 8? She'd pulled it from the shelf with trembling hands. Interesting choice, the keeper murmured. Myra opened the book and began to read. This life started the same. Same family, same childhood, same circumstances. But at certain crucial moments, this Myra had made different choices. Small ones at first, then increasingly significant. At 8, when her parents had pushed her toward academic excellence and away from art classes, this Myra had insisted, had fought to keep drawing, painting, creating. Her parents had eventually relented. At 15, choosing high school courses, Miss Myra had selected art and design instead of all advanced sciences, had faced her parents' disappointment but held firm. At 18, choosing universities, this Myra had gone to art school instead of an Ivy League institution, had pursued illustration and design instead of pre-law. The story unfolded. This Myra became a children's book illustrator, worked from a small studio, made modest income, never achieved traditional success or prestige. But every page of this story, every single page, radiated with a quality the achievement story lacked: joy, presence, genuine engagement with life. This Myra had deep friendships because she had time for them, had a partner she loved because she'd been emotionally available, had created hundreds of books that brought happiness to children, had lived small but lived fully, each day experienced rather than endured. Real Myra, reading this alternative life, felt something crack open in her chest. This was the life she'd wanted, had always wanted, since childhood, since before she learned what she was supposed to want, before achievement and success and prestige had become the only acceptable goals. She'd abandoned that wanting so completely that she'd forgotten it existed, had buried it under layers of should, and must, and be realistic, had told herself that art was a childish dream, that real adults had real careers, that happiness was less important than accomplishment. But reading this alternative story, seeing a version of herself who'd chosen differently, Myra felt the old wanting resurface, not diminished by decades of denial, but somehow preserved, waiting, patient. Myra closed the book and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere beyond sadness. She was grieving for the life she'd wanted and never lived, grieving for the self she might have been, grieving for 41 years spent reading from the wrong story. The keeper sat beside her, saying nothing, simply present while she grieved. When the tears finally subsided, Myra asked, "Why did you show me this? Now I know what I've lost. Now I have to live with knowing I chose wrong." "Did you choose wrong?" the keeper asked. "Or did you choose based on the information and pressure you had? At the time, your parents wanted security for you. Society told you art wasn't a real career. You were young, uncertain, trying to please people you loved. You made the best choice you could with what you knew, but I've wasted my life. Have you?" The keeper gestured to the book of achievement, still in Myra's other hand. "You've accomplished extraordinary things, built a career many would envy, developed skills and knowledge that life has value. Even if it's not the life that would have brought you joy, what's the point of accomplishment without joy?" "That's the question, isn't it?" the keeper said gently. "And it's a question each person must answer for themselves. Some people find genuine fulfillment in achievement. For them, that story is the right one. But for you, they touch the illustrated life story. This was your story, and you abandoned it. Can I go back?" Myra asked desperately. "Can I start over, make different choices?" "No," the keeper said. "Time only moves forward. You can't relive the past differently." But they stood and pulled another book from the shelf. Myra Patel, The Life She Chose at 41. You can choose a new story from here. You're not locked into the achievement narrative forever just because. You've been reading from it for 41 years. You can close that book and open a new one. The story will be different. You'll be starting from 41 instead of 8, with different circumstances, different constraints. But it can still be a story of choosing what you actually want instead of what you think you should want. Myra took the new book with shaking hands. This story started not at birth, but today, right now, 41-year-old Myra standing in a library of infinite possibilities being offered a choice. She read about the version of herself who chose to leave corporate law, who went back to school for art and design, who spent 2 years living frugally while retraining, who at 43 got her first job as a junior designer, who at 45 illustrated her first children's book, who at 50 had built a modest but fulfilling career creating beauty and bringing joy to children. This story acknowledged the difficulties, the financial stress, the judgment from former colleagues, the fear of starting over, the embarrassment of being a beginner in her 40s. But it also showed the rewards, the daily pleasure of creative work, the satisfaction of developing a skill she'd abandoned, the rightness of living according to her actual values, the relief of no longer performing a version of success that meant nothing to her. Reading this possible future, Myra felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, not the grim determination to achieve the next milestone, but genuine hope, the possibility of a life that was actually hers. "Can this really happen?" she asked. "It already is happening," the keeper said, "in the sense that you're now aware of it as a possibility. Awareness changes everything. Before coming here, you didn't know you were reading from the wrong story. You thought the achievement narrative was the only one. Now you know there are alternatives. That knowledge will change how you read the rest of your life. What if I fail? What if I try to change stories and end up with something worse than what I have? Failure is only meaningful within a particular story," the keeper said. In the achievement story, professional, failure is devastating. But in the story you wanted at 8, in the new story starting at 41, there's no failure. Only learning, growing, creating. The metrics are different. Success looks different. You can't fail at living your actual life, only at living someone else's. When Myra finally prepared to leave the library, the keeper gave her a gift, a blank book with her name on it. "This is the story you'll write from here," they said. It starts now. You know what you want now, what you value, what makes you feel alive. Whether you change everything or change nothing, you'll never read your life the same way again. You'll always know you're choosing your story. Mira left the library and found herself back on the street where she'd been walking. No time had passed. The library existed outside normal time, outside normal space. But she was changed, fundamentally. She couldn't go back to reading her life the way she had before. She went to work the next day, sat at her desk, looked at the contracts and briefs and legal documents, and felt nothing. No engagement, no sense of purpose, just the recognition that she was reading from a story she didn't want to be in. She lasted 3 more months. 3 months of continuing the achievement narrative while knowing with absolute certainty that it wasn't her story. 3 months of performing while her actual self screamed to be released. Then she quit, gave notice, endured the shocked responses from colleagues, the disappointment from her parents, the concern from friends who thought she was having a breakdown. Maybe she was, breaking down the false story to get to the true one. She enrolled in design school. Felt ridiculous the first day, surrounded by students 15 years younger. Felt terrified that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Felt her achievement-oriented brain screaming that she was throwing away everything she'd worked for. But she also felt something else, rightness, the sense of being in her actual story rather than someone else's, the relief of no longer performing. The transition wasn't smooth. Mara struggled financially, struggled with her identity as a beginner, struggled with the voice that said she'd made a terrible mistake. But something was different now. She had the library experience to anchor her. She knew she was choosing her story consciously, and that knowledge made the difficulty bearable. When she felt like a failure for being 41 and starting over, she reminded herself failure only exists in the achievement story. In this story, she was exactly where she needed to be, learning, growing, developing, the skills she should have developed decades ago. When her parents expressed disappointment, she reminded herself they were reading from their story for her life, not her actual story. Their disappointment was about their narrative not matching reality, not about her choices being wrong. When money was tight and she questioned everything, she reminded herself she'd read both stories. She knew what 41 years of achievement without joy looked like. She knew what the next 40 years would be if she stayed in that narrative, and she'd rather struggle in her own story than succeed in someone else's. Slowly, painfully, she rewrote her life, not erasing the first 41 years. They'd happened. They'd taught her things. They were part of her story, even if they weren't the story she wanted, but adding new chapters, different chapters about learning and creating and slowly, gradually building a life that felt like hers. 3 years after leaving the library, Myra was working as a junior designer at a small firm, still learning, still building skills. She illustrated on weekends, developing a portfolio, hoping eventually to break into children's books. She wasn't successful by achievement story standards. She made 1/3 of her old salary, lived in a smaller apartment, had no impressive title or trajectory, but she woke up most mornings without dread, spent her days doing work she enjoyed, had time for friendships, for walks, for noticing the texture of living, felt like herself for the first time since childhood. One Saturday, illustrating in a coffee shop, she noticed a little girl watching her draw. The girl was maybe 6, transfixed by the images appearing on the page. "That's beautiful," the girl said. Myra smiled. "Thank you. Do you like to draw?" "I love it," the girl said. "But my mom says I have to focus on school. That art is just for fun, not for real." Mira's heart clenched. She recognized this moment. This was where her story had started to go wrong. When adults had told her art wasn't real, wasn't valuable, wasn't a legitimate path. "Can I tell you something?" Myra said. "I'm 44 years old. I spent the first 41 years of my life listening to people who told me art wasn't real work, and I was miserable. Then I finally decided to do what I actually loved instead of what I was supposed to love, and now I'm happy." The girl looked at her with wide eyes. "Really?" "Really," Myra confirmed. "You're 6, so you probably can't make big decisions about your life yet. But remember, your life is your story, not your mom's story for you. Not what anyone else thinks you should do. When you're older, you get to choose which story you want to live. Choose the one that's actually yours." The girl's mother called her away, and Mira went back to her illustration. But something had shifted. She'd just changed a story. Not her own this time, but maybe, possibly, another child who might otherwise abandon her. Dreams had ate the way Myra had. That moment held more meaning than any achievement in her legal career ever had, because it was part of her actual story, the one she wanted, the one where she created beauty and encouraged creation in others. Mira was 47 when she illustrated her first published children's book. Small press, small advance. Most people would consider it a minor accomplishment. But holding that book, seeing her art printed, knowing children would experience the story through her images, Myra felt a satisfaction she'd never felt earning a much larger salary or winning a prestigious case. This was her story, finally, fully. She was living the narrative she wanted, not the one she thought she should want. She thought often of the library, of the keeper, of the infinite stories on those shelves. She understood now that everyone was reading from some story. Most people from stories handed to them by family, culture, circumstance. Stories that might not be theirs at all. And most people never realized they could close one book and open another. Never knew they were choosing their narrative, or that the narrative they were reading might not be the one they wanted. You, too, are reading from a story right now. The story of your life as you understand it, as you're living it, as you think it should be. But is it your story? Or is it a story someone else wrote for you? You don't have to change everything tonight. You don't have to close one book and open another tomorrow. But you can begin to see that you're reading from a narrative, that it's one story among many possible stories, that you have the power to examine whether it's the story you want. Your life is a story. You get to choose which one you're reading from, and it's never too late to close one book and open another. Rest now. Let these thoughts settle gently. Let sleep come naturally. The library will be there if you need it. Your stories are waiting,